All right, let me tell you a story that happened to me. I used to be buddies with this guy who had a massive fish farm down in Louisiana. I mean, this place was so big, it seemed like it went on forever. And it was right on the edge of the bayou. He had a bunch of fish ponds on his property, you know? The whole idea was to attract and keep fish for harvesting. People would pay good money to come and fish for a prize catch like a big old catfish or something. So his regular guy fell ill and he needed someone to take care of the place and make sure everything was running smooth. I said, sure, why not? And he brought me down there for a few days to help out. There were a bunch of ponds and several little huts scattered around the property. It was my job to check on the fish in the morning and the evening. The prize fish were tagged and the price he charged depended on the size of the fish. He had some real whoppers in there. One evening I'm doing my rounds, it's around 5 p.m. As the sun started to set, the feeding machines kicked in and started dropping food into the ponds. I started counting the fish as they came up to eat. The fish were done feeding just as the sun was going down. It was early winter and it got dark real quick. I was just about to wrap up for the night when I heard this splashing sound coming from behind one of the huts. I figured the fish were done eating, but maybe they were still hungry or something. I closed the hut door and peeked out the window to see if any fish were coming up to feed. I shined my flashlight out on the water to see if I could spot any ripples or anything, but I didn't see anything. The splashing got louder. I tried to look through the window again, but my flashlight was so dim it was useless. I had forgotten to charge it before I left and the battery was almost gone. Knowing I couldn't see anything, I figured I should just head back. But just as I was about to leave, I heard this strange gurgling sound. It wasn't like anything I did heard before. It was kind of high-pitched and, honestly, it sounded kind of scary. Whatever it was outside the hut and sounded like it was swimming around in the pond. Now, I did heard tales of gators being spotted in the bayou, but those stories were few and far between. And this didn't sound like any gator I did ever heard. The sound would gurgle and then almost turn into a growl. So I figured I did just stay in the hut for a bit and not risk running into whatever was out there in the dark. I used to really enjoy helping my buddy out, but it felt like this time I did sign up for a bit more than I bargained for. As I sat in the hut, that strange sound seemed to be getting louder, and I was getting more and more spooked. I tried to see what was going on outside, but it was tough to make anything out with the moon only half full. Then, I saw something move. Something big was swimming around just outside the hut. I mean, it's hard to even believe what I'm about to tell you, even though I was the one who saw it. This thing, it was huge, like a good 7 or 8 feet long, and it looked, well, it didn't look normal. It was like a cross between a human and a gator, with a head that looked kind of like a snake. My heart was racing as I realized that I was dealing with something that didn't seem to belong in our world. I tried to keep calm while I watched the creature swim around the pond. I could make out its eyes that were glowing yellow in the dark, and I just knew. This thing was smart, and I needed to stay sharp. It seemed to be searching for something, and I had this feeling that if it found me, I would be in big trouble. As the hours ticked by, I stayed hunkered down inside the hut, hoping that the creature would eventually lose interest and leave. But I had this nagging feeling it knew I was there, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay hidden. Man, I was kicking myself for not bringing a gun or something with me. Mostly I stayed hidden, but every now and then I would peek out. After what felt like forever, I saw it stop and start sniffing the water or something. Suddenly, something shot out from the reeds and started splashing around. I was frozen watching it and realized it was a nutria. The gator snake thing immediately sprang into action and went after the nutria. The poor thing was trying to escape, making all kinds of noise, and then nothing. All sound stopped, and I'm sure it got caught. I didn't waste any time getting out of the hut and into my truck that was about 100 feet away. I drove out of there like a bat out of hell. When I got to my cabin, I felt like I had run a marathon. I had one of the worst nights of my life, just lying there, unable to sleep, going over and over in my mind what that thing could have been. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as I could. Come morning, I was out of there. I called my buddy and told him I didn't know what the hell was in his pond, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I left that place and haven't been back since. All right, let's get the show on the road. I don't want to spill too many beans here. You never know who's watching or listening. The world got a taste of the unknown when those UFO tapes hit the news a while back. If the big wigs in their high towers can stomach that, I reckon this won't cause much of a stir. So for the purpose of this little chat, let's say my name's Doe, John Doe. Back in my younger years, around 2015 to 2020, I served my time in the U.S. Army. Spent most of it stationed in the arid landscapes of the Middle East. My role? Nothing you'd write home about, but important nonetheless. I was a signal support system specialist, a fancy title for someone who ensures communication lines are up and running. We were holed up in one of those forward operating bases in the heart of Afghanistan. The place was no paradise, but it was home for a time. You learn to appreciate the little things like a warm meal or a night without mortar fire. I always had an affinity for the nights there. The desert has a way of making the stars seem brighter, more alive. One of those nights I was on radio duty overseeing the communication. Just as the monotony was starting to set in, a crackle came through the speakers. Not unusual. The desert plays tricks on the equipment. But then, it was followed by a voice. A pilot, flying a routine surveillance mission, spoke in rushed, hushed tones. He'd spotted something that didn't belong in the Afghani night sky. The initial reaction was a possible enemy aircraft. We were in a war zone after all. I reported the chatter to my commanding officer, and within minutes, the forward operating base was buzzing with activity. But it wasn't panic. It was more of an eerie anticipation. You see, this wasn't a conventional aircraft according to our pilot. It was something else. I managed to catch a glimpse of the sky through the slit in our communications tent. There it was, a bright, pulsating light. Unnatural. Unearthly. It hung in the sky, almost mocking us with its presence. It darted around in ways that defied logic, as if the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it shot off into the night, leaving a trail of light that lingered for a few moments before fading away. We were left in a state of stunned silence. Even the desert seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. The rest of the night was a whirlwind. System checks, radar sweeps, debriefings. The official line was an unidentified aerial phenomenon, but we knew better. Now, I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was something we couldn't explain. Something that still gives me chills when I think about it. After the initial shock wore off, life at the forward operating base resumed its usual pace. But the atmosphere had changed. That night had introduced an undercurrent of unease. We still did our jobs, kept up the patrols, and maintained the equipment. But every light in the sky brought a moment of silence, a collective holding of breath. A few days later, I was on night shift again. The base was quiet, most of the guys catching some shut-eye. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. It was our pilot, the same one from the other night. He was on another routine flyover when he spotted it again. The light. This time, he was ordered to approach. I could hear the reluctance in his voice, but he followed orders. As he got closer, his commentary became more sporadic. Words like impossible and not natural floated through the communication. Then, without warning, his feed went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. The commanding officer barked orders. A scramble was initiated, but it was too late. Our pilot was gone. His last known coordinates showed him over an empty stretch of desert. We spent the next few days scouring the desert, but there was no sign of him or the aircraft. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Eventually, we had to give up the search. The official report stated that the pilot had crashed due to equipment failure. But we knew better. We knew what had really happened. I left the army not long after that. The incident shook me, made me question things I'd always taken for granted. It's been years, but I still find myself looking up at the night sky, wondering. Months later, I was back stateside, my tour of duty over. But the memories of that night in the desert stayed with me, haunting my dreams and filling my waking hours with questions. I tried to get back to normal life, but normal felt like a foreign concept. One night, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, the television droning on in the background. I was lost in my thoughts when a news report caught my attention. It was about those UFO videos that had been making the rounds on the internet. The reporter was interviewing some high-ranking official who was spewing the usual government line. Weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, you know the drill. But then, they showed one of the videos. It was grainy, taken from the cockpit of a military aircraft, but there was no mistaking what I was seeing. That same unnatural light, moving in ways that defied explanation. A shiver ran down my spine. It was them. I was sure of it. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I started researching, reaching out to others who had seen similar things. I even attended a few meetings of UFO enthusiasts, although most of them seemed more interested in conspiracy theories than actual evidence. But every now and then I'd meet someone like me, someone who had seen things they couldn't explain. We'd exchange stories, offer each other support, and try to make sense of our experiences. It was comforting in a way to know I wasn't alone. And so I find myself here, sharing my story with you. I don't know if it'll make a difference. I don't know if anyone will even believe me, but I had to get it out. It's part of my healing process, I guess. All right, so I used to help this buddy of mine with his property in the Florida Everglades every now and then. This wasn't your everyday property, mind you. It was a gigantic gator farm, smack dab in the middle of nowhere. I think he's got about 500 acres, give or take, all swamp and marshlands, and it's so far out it's practically in Cuba. Now he's got about a dozen gator ponds scattered across his property. If you ain't familiar with gator farming, the whole idea is to breed them, raise them, and then sell them. People pay top dollar for gator meat and even more for the hides. Anyway, long story short, his farm hand up and quits one day, and he needed some help running the place. So I thought, why not? And I ended up down there for a couple weeks. There were 12 gator ponds and 12 watchtowers across his farm, all of them filled with these massive, scary-looking gators. Part of my job was to do a head count every morning and evening, make sure none of them had wandered off or eaten each other. Every gator was tagged and tracked, and the price my buddy got for each one depended on their size and age. He had some real monsters in those ponds, let me tell you. One evening, I'm making my rounds about 6 p.m., just as the sun's starting to go down. The ponds are quiet, the gators are all settling in for the night. I'm counting heads, making sure everyone's accounted for. Just as I'm finishing up, the sun sets and it gets real dark real fast. You know how it is in the winter, sun goes down early, and there I am, in the middle of the Everglades, surrounded by gators, in the pitch black. I was about to call it a night when I heard this strange noise coming from behind one of the towers. Now, gators make all sorts of noises, but this was different. It wasn't the usual low grumble of a gator. It was something else, something I'd never heard before. I tried to shine my flashlight out towards the noise, see if I could catch any eye shine in the swamp, but I didn't see anything. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, but then the noise got louder. I tried to shine my light again, but it was too dim to see anything. I'd forgotten to charge it, and the battery was about to die. I was standing there in the dark, in the middle of a gator farm, with some strange noise getting louder and louder. Just when I was about to say forget it and leave, I heard it again, louder this time, and it definitely wasn't a gator. It was this eerie humming sound, vibrating the air around me, and it sounded threatening in a way I can't really explain. Whatever was making that noise, it was out there in the dark, moving around. And it wasn't a gator. Now, I've heard stories about things in the Everglades, stories about big cats, panthers, things like that. But this didn't sound like any cat I've ever heard. The sound was like a vibration, and then it would turn into a kind of hissing noise. I decided right then and there to stay put in the tower and not risk running into whatever was out there in the dark. I always enjoyed helping my friend with his farm, but that night, I got more than I bargained for. As I sat there in the tower, that strange sound was getting louder and louder, and I was getting more and more freaked out. I tried to look out into the darkness, but with the moon just a sliver in the sky, it was almost impossible to see anything. But then, I saw something. Something moving just outside the tower. Now, I know this is going to sound nuts, even to me, and I was the one who saw it. The thing moving around was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. It looked like a cross between a human and, I don't know, some kind of prehistoric animal. It had a head that looked like a snake's. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I was looking at something that didn't belong in this world. Not in any world I knew, at least. I tried to keep my breathing steady while I watched this creature moving back and forth out there in the dark. Its eyes were glowing, a sickly yellow color, and even though I couldn't see much else, I knew this thing was smart and dangerous. It was searching for something, and I had a sinking feeling that something was me. As the minutes turned into hours, I stayed hidden in the tower, praying this creature would lose interest and move on. But I had a feeling it knew I was there, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay hidden. I was kicking myself for not bringing a gun with me. I stayed crouched down, only daring to peek out every once in a while. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it stop and start sniffing the air. That's when something shot out from the undergrowth and started squealing. It was a wild boar, and the creature went after it like a bolt of lightning. The poor thing was squealing like mad, and then silence. It had been caught. I took that opportunity to make a run for it, to my truck parked about 100 yards away, and I drove out of there like the devil himself was chasing me. When I finally got back to my room, I was completely drained. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, going over and over in my mind what I'd seen, what it could have been. All I knew was I wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. The next morning, I called my friend and told him, "Look, I don't know what the heck is on your property, but I ain't sticking around to find out." So I left. I packed up my stuff and I drove away from that place as fast as I could. And let me tell you, I haven't been back since. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't really want to know. All I know is, it's something I don't ever want to run into again. I mean, I've seen a lot of things in my life, but that was something else. Something from a nightmare. And it wasn't just the sight of it, it was the feeling it gave me. Like I was prey, you know? Like I was being hunted. But anyway, that's my story. I don't know if you believe it or not, but it's true. Every word of it. You can choose to believe me or not, but I know what I saw. And I know I don't ever want to see it again. So I had this buddy named Dale. He used to live in the bustling city of Chicago, but he decided to move out to the wilds of Alaska. The nature, the wildlife, the fresh air and all that, you know? Now Dale, he'd always been a city boy. So moving to a cabin in Alaska, that was a whole new world for him. His uncle had left him this cabin in his will. Dale thought it was a good chance to start fresh, you know? So he packed up his life, left his job, said goodbye to the Chicago deep dish pizzas, and off he went. He'd visited the cabin a few times before, of course, every now and then when he got some vacation time, but living there, that was a whole other story. When Dale got there, it was pretty much how he remembered it. The log cabin, the lake nearby, the dense forest around. He started settling in, getting the cabin up and running. One thing Dale loved about the cabin was the beautiful view of the lake. He'd sit on the porch, drink his coffee, and just watch the stillness of the water. It was peaceful. But one day he noticed something off. There were usually ducks and other birds on the lake. That day, though, it was empty. Quiet. Like they'd all decided to take a vacation or something. He shrugged it off. Probably just a bad day for the birds or something, he thought. The next day, Dale noticed the same thing. No ducks, no birds, nothing. The lake was still as glass. That was strange. It got him thinking, got him worrying. He felt something was off but couldn't quite put his finger on it. Dale decided to walk around the lake, see if he could find any signs of what was going on. That's when he noticed these weird tracks. Kind of like a bird's tracks, but much bigger. And claws. Like a big bird. A really big bird. Dale got back to the cabin and couldn't help but think. Get a camera, he remembered his buddy from Chicago saying once when they were discussing wildlife spotting. He found an old one in his uncle's stuff. He'd used it for hunting or something. He decided to set up the camera near the lake. By the time he was done, it was getting late. He headed back to the cabin. The next morning, he went out to the lake. The camera was knocked over. The tracks were there again. But this time there was something else. Feathers. Big black feathers. And lots of them. Dale felt a chill run down his spine. He picked up the camera and headed back to the cabin. He had a feeling that he was about to discover something. Something big. So Dale, he gets back to the cabin. He hooks up the camera to his laptop. He's not exactly tech savvy, but he manages. The camera had a bit of footage before it got knocked over. Now, the footage, it was all normal at first. The still lake, the occasional gust of wind. But then, late at night, something appeared. It was big. It moved like a bird, but it was too big to be a bird. It seemed to be looking for something around the lake. And then, it got closer to the camera. And then, bam, the screen goes blank. The camera was knocked over. But Dale, he managed to freeze the frame just before the camera got knocked over. And what he saw, it sent chills down his spine. The creature, it had the face of a bird, a beak, but it also had these shark teeth. And the eyes, they were glowing, even in the black and white footage. Dale sat there staring at the frozen image. He didn't know what to think. He didn't know what to do. He was a city boy after all. This was way out of his league. Dale finally shook himself out of it. He decided he had to do something. He couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He decided to call the local wildlife officer, someone who might know what this creature was, or at least he hoped they would. Dale tried to explain what he saw. The big bird-like creature, the tracks, the feathers. He sent them the footage. The wildlife officer was stumped too. He'd never seen anything like it. He promised to look into it and let Dale know if he found anything. That night, Dale couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the creature, the big bird with teeth. He wondered if it would come back. He wondered what it wanted. And then, he heard it. A loud, strange call. It was coming from the lake. So Dale, he hears this call. It's unlike anything he's ever heard before. Like a bird's screech, but deeper, more ominous. He couldn't just sit there. He grabs a flashlight and steps outside. The night was darker than usual, clouds blocking out the moonlight. He walks towards the lake, the call getting louder. As he nears the lake, he sees it. The creature, it's there, just by the water's edge. It was bigger than he'd thought, taller than him even. Its feathers were black, shiny under the weak flashlight. It turned around and Dale, he couldn't help but freeze. It was the creature from the footage, but seeing it up close, it was much more terrifying. The beak, the teeth, the glowing eyes. Dale slowly backed away, not taking his eyes off the creature. It seemed to be watching him, curious, but it didn't move towards him. Dale made it back to the cabin, his heart pounding. He spent the night awake, listening to the creature's call. wondering what it was, what it wanted. The next day, Dale decided to head into town. He needed to talk to someone, the wildlife officer, or anyone who would listen. In town, folks looked at him like he was crazy. A giant bird creature in their small, quiet town? He couldn't blame them. He would have thought the same if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. Days turned into weeks. Dale kept seeing the creature. At night by the lake, it never threatened him. Just stayed by the lake, doing whatever it was doing. Dale didn't understand it, but he decided to coexist. He started to document the creature, its habits, its calls. He even gave it a name, Ravenous. After its raven-like appearance, he started to feel less afraid, more curious. What was Ravenous? Why was it here? Was it alone? So many questions. Dale knew he was in the middle of something big, something most people wouldn't believe, but he had the proof. The footage, the photos, the giant bird creature of the Alaskan lake. Ravenous. He decided to share his discovery. He reached out to wildlife experts, bird watchers, anyone who might be interested. He knew it would be hard for people to believe him, but he had to try. So Dale, he's reaching out to all these people. He's sharing his story, his footage, his observations. He's hoping someone would take him seriously, but all he gets are dismissals. He gets responses, sure, but they're all the same. It's probably a hoax. It's just a large bird, nothing more. Stop wasting our time. It was disheartening. All right, so this takes us back to the late 80s. I was just starting out as a young cop in this small Midwest town. Kind of the place where everyone knew everyone, you know? I was renting this little one-bedroom place in the heart of town. Now, it wasn't anything fancy, but it was home and I loved it. So one day I get this letter in the mail from the landlord. It turns out he's selling the building and I've got a month to find a new place. You can imagine how that felt. I was panicking, didn't know where to look. And then there was Joe, this old-timer at the station who heard about my situation. He told me about this vacant house down the road that was owned by his cousin. Said it was in a rough state, but I could live there rent-free if I fixed it up. I was desperate, so I decided to take him up on his offer. And boy, he wasn't kidding about the house being in a rough state. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. But you know, there was something about it. It had character. I decided to roll up my sleeves and get to work. A few weeks in, I meet my neighbor, this old lady named Edna. She was kind of peculiar, always kept to herself. But she had this huge fenced-off backyard that she never used. It was always so quiet over there. Then one night, I'm up late, working on the house, and I hear this strange noise coming from Edna's yard. I ignored it at first, but it kept going, so I decided to check it out. It was late, you know, around midnight. The town was quiet, but this noise, it was unlike anything I'd ever heard. So curiosity got the best of me. I decided to go over and see what was going on. As I walked towards Edna's fence, the sounds got louder. It was a growl, but not like a dog or a bear. This was deeper. It sounded ancient, like something from a time long gone. I reached the fence and peered over. The yard was dark, except for this dim light coming from a small shed in the corner. And in that dim light, I saw it. This massive, hulking figure hunched over something. This creature. I can't even begin to describe it. It was like some kind of reptilian humanoid. Its skin was scaly and rough, gleaming under the dim light. But its face, it was almost human-like but warped, twisted. Its eyes, they were this deep, fiery red. They glowed in the darkness, giving off this eerie light. When it heard me, it stopped what it was doing and looked up. It had this look. It was almost like it was annoyed at being disturbed. Its eyes narrowed and it gave this low hiss. And then it started to stand up. I swear to you, it must have been at least 7 feet tall. I could see its muscular body covered in those thick scales. It looked right at me, its eyes burning with a primal rage. I could see its sharp claws glistening in the light. For a moment, time stood still. It was just me and this creature staring each other down. I was petrified. My heart was beating so fast I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. Then it let out this roar. It was deafening. It echoed through the night, shaking me to my core. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I turned and ran into my house, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head. The sight of that creature. It was like something out of a nightmare. I went over to Edna's the next day and she had no idea what happened. There was nothing in her backyard. I must have checked 10 times that day. So I ended up doing a little digging. Turns out Edna's house was owned by her son who lived out of state. He had no idea what was going on either. I told him about the creature, and he was as shocked as I was. The next month, Edna was gone. Her son came and cleaned out the house. They never found any creature, though. The house was sold and the new owners completely renovated the place. But to this day, I'll never forget that creature in Edna's backyard. It's one of those things that stays with you